Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. This is sugaring season in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, and today's guest is basically synonymous with sugaring. It's Steve Wheeler of Derby, the owner of Jed's Maple. Welcome to the show. I always want to call you Jed.
Well,
you're not Jed. Your son is Jed.
No,
you're Steve.
It would not be the first time I'm called Jed, though. I promise you that.
Right. Yeah, that's because when you hear Jed's Maple, you think, well, the owner is Jed.
Right.
No, it's actually named after one of your sons.
The oldest son. When this was supposed to be a hobby, just the hobby went awry, and now, but it's the name is stuck, and for good, bad, or otherwise, I tell you, Scott, it's been very good in the South. When somebody says, I need to, find somebody I want to buy some pure maple syrup, they look Vermont maple syrup, they see the name Jed and say, now Jed, now there's a name I can.
Jed Clampett from the Beverly Hillbillies.
That's remarkably very easy to remember that for people, and yes, there's a connection there.
Right.
Not on purpose.
So we're also we're going to talk a little bit about the history of sugaring, but also sugar makers in Vermont have a very special day coming up.
Couple days, April 2nd and 3rd. On the 2nd and 3rd, we have Maple Open House Weekend, and it's across the state of Vermont. Sugar houses will be open all over the state, and on top of that, here in the Northeast Kingdom, there's going to be several operations that will also be open to the public. So if you want to go out and about, that's a great time to be doing so. And we, of course, will be open as well. We'll have a lot of things. We always make it a very special weekend. Because it is, we promote the history of maple, we promote maple, and we're promoting Vermont. That is what, by definition, what a sugar maker should probably do in the state of Vermont. We're part of a bigger family. It's a tradition, generational tradition, and we carry it on.
It's interesting if you look back, this year you're well into making syrup.
We are.
But back last year, I think it was way winter never ended, and this year we didn't have a winter.
No, we were ready for sugaring in March, but never really made any syrup till April. Last year it was a very late season, and talk about night and day. Last year, whenever you have leaks in pipeline in the woods, and you have to go find them. We were slugging through 2-3 feet of snow, and did not look forward to going to find the leaks. We were hoping that everything was fine. This year, there's almost no snow. Right now, there is no snow to speak of in the woods, and walking the woods is so easy, and of course it makes you feel good to be out in the woods. This time of year, the sun's kind of showing through the clouds, and you're out there. It's beautiful.
Do you think this is going to spoil you for next year?
Definitely, yeah. This is one of those memories. It's one of those things where you say, "Geez, I can't look. I can't wait to next year because it's what a great season we're having." And we are remarkably too. We're also making a pile of syrup.
I was going to ask you because this. I don't think anybody alive today, from what I've been told and from my weather friends, we've ever seen a winter like this. No. And but what has it meant to the sugaring business?
Well, I guess if you look across in the southern part of the state, I've heard a few unfortunate stories. Again, we promote maple across. You're never going to make so much syrup that the price of syrup just evaporates. So we actually cheer on sugar makers all over the state. And the southern part of the state got too warm this year. And sometimes we stayed too cold, and when it warmed up, it got warm too fast, and we had a short season here where southern Vermont had a great season. It's vice versa this year. It got so warm so quick down there. They hit 75 degrees down in Bennington, and whether you like it or not, that's going to dry up the taps. It causes the trees to just naturally start healing.
So are you having a banner year, would you say?
Oh boy, we're over half a crop right now, and just we're making a lot of syrup, and this is great. I mean, we're happy for ourselves, but it's it could change on a dime too.
Right. All right. First of all, I want to apologize to my radio listeners because you won't be able to see the historical items that Steve brought with him, but he'll kind of explain it to the folks in Radio Land. So you've been in the sugaring business almost all of your life.
That's correct.
And even in your time, you've seen some changes. But I see one thing here. You have an old sap bucket, which is wood. Now that goes before your time, but Have you spoken to people who remember the days of the wooden sap buckets?
Actually, my grandfather started with wooden sap buckets when he was a kid. So it's interesting. That piece alone, it's a wooden stave sap bucket, and they're tapered, and it's shiplap. It's actually fitted lumber. So if you could see the bucket, if you're on the radio, this is kind of unfortunate. But the fact is with a taper like this, you're bound to have some leaks. And I like to ask the kids when we give tours of the museum, these are pieces from the museum, I ask them, how do you think they kept it from leaking when they put them in the woods? Because the first sap would obviously leak out the cracks. And the secret was, and this came from my grandfather, the story is, they would go to the woods, they would pack the evaporator full of snow, and he and his brothers, they'd light a fire underneath and keep adding snow until they got a good amount of water, create steam, and they'd make a pyramid of these wooden buckets up over the back pan, and they would steam them, swelled, and as soon as they swelled, they'd put them in a snowbank, and pretty ingenious, really. They could swell them up and keep them that way for sugar season.
And even before European settlers, it's been said that the Abenaki and other Indian groups, Native American groups, understood that you could harvest the sap from the trees.
Absolutely true. But they did it differently. They would heat rocks in the fire and then put the rocks submerge them in the sap and within hollowed out logs.
Right.
And they could eventually bring it to enough of a hot where it'd steam off, and they could eventually get pretty close to syrup and actually cook it down with sweetmeats and such.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, how do you collect? So you now have all Toobin?
We do.
And
well,
when
we have a handful of buckets we put out front.
Right.
I mean, it's the nostalgia.
So when did Toobin really begin?
Well, I've got some actually. That's one of the pieces here. Tubing came out really. There was a foray into metal tubing, which because metal is not flexible enough, you really had a very small amount of space that you could tap into. But when they came out with plastic tubing, now you got some flexibility and you could move up and down, and that worked out pretty well. In the early 70s is when it really came into advent. My grandfather and dad, that tubing right here is from one of the original boxes my dad bought back then with my grandfather, and I have an unopened box. It's mint perfect shape, bought from Leader. It was actually made in Rutland, and so in the early 70s, it was all new. It was back then it was made of PVC, a little different material than now. But
and I actually, if I recall right, the property where you now own was where some of the first Toobin appeared in this region. Now, who was the owner again?
Now, Warren Mitchell. Warren Mitchell did a lot of the work on tubing and investigating tubing and using it. He was always an inventor. He came up with vacuums, the first vacuum system too. It's really the grandparent of the vacuum systems we use today, where he actually applied vacuum to a chamber and had a pump that would release the sap from the pump even under vacuum, and they called it the Mitchell system, and my dad owned one. It was just a few years ago. I wish I hadn't now, but I sold it maybe about 8-10 years ago. I wish I had it now because I could put it in the museum.
Right.
But you keep upgrading. When you do, you sell the old and you invest in the new. But yeah, he was really a smart guy, and he did do a lot of work with tubing in his own woods, which we now own. And yeah, it's a nice piece to have to say, yeah, that was some of the first tubing made.
I've interviewed some of the people, the Asian sugar makers, and some of them are now past, but they remember when when tube first came out, and they just said, sure, we'll experiment with it or let people experiment, and it won't ever last.
Right.
And sure enough, it did, because some of my favorite photos though that I have in my collection, my old photos, is of the collecting of the sap in the old days, because they would go around with their horses and pulling the
gathering tanks on the dray.
And but that's probably a lot more work than what you have to do now, isn't it?
Yeah, and I remember doing that. It wasn't actually on ours. We always had central tank that had actually piping down to the sugar house. That house piping back then, down to the sugar house. So we always collected to a tank. But I remember I'd go help my great uncle Jude, and when we did that, well, then we had to follow around. They had a tractor, but yes, and that was work because the tractor kept moving and he was creeping around the woods. So we would hang the bucket almost go to the next tree almost at a jog so that we could keep following the tractor
So
through the woods.
it was a lot more romantic looking than actually doing it.
Oh, yeah, you could say that
Yeah,
for
but
sure.
you sugar makers seem to have a sickness. You seem to, and when I say that, I mean that nicely. You seem to love, like I interview sugar makers, and you guys love it. You might complain about the snow, but I'm going to tell you, most sugar makers either hang it up after they're dead, or they can no longer physically do it. It's just something they have to do.
Well, there's two things that come to mind. The first one is my dad will be 80 this year, and we do all the woods work and stuff, but by gosh, he doesn't miss. I'm boiling. He stops in. He'll sit back there. He'll draw syrup off. He'll taste it. He'll make sure quality's there. My dad is actively involved in our sugaring. He hauls sap. Anything he can do, he will do, and he's saved me a lot of time and money in all the things. And sometimes it's a suggestion he makes, but he's hauling my sap for me as often as he can in his schedule, and he does it because he loves it. But I tell you, my wife, I asked her, I said, childbirth seemed so hard to me. I was like, I watched you go through it. I was right there in the room with you, and both times, and wow, I'm just in awe. And she doesn't remember any of the pain. Now, forgive me, I don't want to liken this as much as, but you know what? I seem to forget. Sometimes I love sugaring, and we've had bad years, but next year's going to be a better year. So similar but very different. But yeah.
Yeah, that's what I've gotten from people. And then in recent months, you lost one of your very prominent sugar makers in the area, was Paula Turno, and I think he did whatever he could right until the very end.
He did, and he loved sugaring. I loved going to his sugar house. He was so proud of his syrup, and he always made very good syrup. And he would pull a sample and say, "What do you think of that?" And he'd look right at you, and he wanted to know your honest opinion. He didn't want you to lie, but it was good syrup. So
if I think of where yours is, you're on the Derby Pond Road. Is there any roads in between his sugar bush and your sugar bush?
Well, Nelson Hill Road splits it, and there's a little field.
That's true, too.
There's a little
That's
field
true.
there, but yeah, I can stand in my woods and look right into the back of Paula Turno's woods. Yeah.
Right.
But I think it probably was treed at one time, but they needed to make a field, so.
Right. So what else do you have? You have a yoke.
Yes. There's something very interesting about the yoke. So we're going to hold it up here. And if you notice, the yoke is made to fit around the neck, but it won't even go on to me. But it's a small opening. And back in the days, say the early 1900s, when you had a yoke, it's because the children were going to wear the yoke, not the adults. The mom and dad would boil in the sugar house, and the children would go collect sap, and you'd have a hanger rope on either side of the yoke, and the children's legs were much stronger than their arms. They could carry 2 5-gallon pails of sap or through the woods easy enough and not spill because it was balanced. And the children became very adept. You had they could carry a lot more syrup to the gathering tank.
Now, we've talked about all the work that goes into it, but because of the technology, you're not spending days on end in the sugar house anymore, like back in the old, because of like the reverse osmosis machine. Now, what is reverse osmosis?
It's really simple. It sounds really technical, but quite honestly, for $5 to $10 of electricity, this machine mechanically separates water from the sap. It removes water from the sap. It's a very easy mechanical process by adding pressure to sap and giving water an exit place, which is the center of the membrane. You put a lot of pressure, and the holes in the membrane are only big enough to let water through, not sugar molecules. The water goes to where there's no pressure, and the sugary water stays trapped, and it just cycles around. If you keep adding pressure, you get it sweeter, but physically just taking water from sap.
And so that doesn't actually transform it into syrup. It then goes to where?
It goes to a gathering tank where it can be boiled down. All it's doing is it's shortening the process of boiling. And I marveled because I see a 1-inch pipe of water just headed out to a tank where we keep it separate for washing because you recycle all the water you can. But the process was this long to boil it off in my 5-foot by 16 evaporator years ago. And then by reverse osmosis, we shortened it. We made about a quarter of the time to boil, and that time you get back, and all that time we were boiling wood, it was a lot less fuel we burned. We were saving hundreds and hundreds of dollars by spending $5 to $10 a day. That's a no-brainer in my book. That machine has paid for itself, my reverse osmosis. The first year it paid for itself.
Right. Was that one of those things where at first you were kind of, yeah, but
it took me years to come to that conclusion that I could do it and not change. I always heard, oh, you can change the flavor of syrup. And you can. I honestly will admit you can change the flavor of your syrup if you boil too fast. We had to find that happy medium where we tasted and kept sweetening and sweetening until we said, all right, I think we see some of the flavor tailing off now. We're not cooking it long enough, not finishing it, just like finishing a fine meal. So we backed off on the sweetness to make sure we always had enough finishing time. And now we win awards at the fairs and such, so I can't see that there's any change of flavor now.
Now, I know I visit your place a few times a year, usually even for my kid, one of my kids' weddings. I got a whole bunch of wedding favors, but and then I visit Kuchar's and I visit some others. But one I really enjoy visiting too for a different reason is Charlie Drown's place.
Yes, Charlie.
I guess that's actually technically Coventry because it's a spur of land, but most people think it was Newport Center, heading out towards Newport Center. And he's about as primitive as you can get.
Although, I got to admit, I actually ran the pipeline in that woods.
Oh, that's true. He does have pipeline.
He put pipeline in. He finally says it's time to get a little more modern. He says, I can't, he didn't want to go collect buckets the rest of his life. So we did make that venture into pipeline. But yes, you go into the sugar house, he has not messed with it. It is still, he boils it the old-fashioned way, and with a wood fire, he'll sit in the corner and watch everything, make sure, and he'll get up, he'll make sure the syrup hasn't lost its flavor. He's hands-on.
But are all sugar makers storytellers too? Because I have found that people, like, of course, Charlie has two things going for him. He's a sugar maker, and I think they're great storytellers, but he's also a forester, and I've never known a forester, whether it was George Buzzell or Charlie's father, Jersey Drown. They were all great storytellers. Something about hanging out in the woods.
I think you have access to enough material to make a nice story, and people want to relate things they've seen. So sugar makers see a lot of things too. So I think maybe that's where the whole story comes from is, boy, you're in the woods long enough, and some of the things you see are really interesting to other people, and we want to pass that on. But yeah, Charlie, he's got some great stories.
And
he's so humble too,
Oh, yeah, he is. He's a great guy. Now, since the days of this equipment, sugaring has actually grown in Vermont, hasn't it?
Oh, it has. It's not unusual for you to hear about sugaring operations starting up, never made syrup before. They're going to be 10, 20, even 30,000 taps right out of the gate. And here we have a little operation. We have 4,600 this year, and we're going to add another 1,000 next year. And that's a big jump for us to add 1,000. But they're starting out humongous, just unheard of. And when I was a kid, when I was 6, you never heard of more than 10,000 taps. That was very rare. And it's, but there's a little bit of money in maple syrup right now, a little bit, granted. And people are jumping in on the wagon while there is some. And you don't get really rich, but if you can do it in large scale, you can have some economies of scale to gain and win some.
And I think there's another movement. I think there's another movement too. I think more people. It's kind of funny when people, especially people who've never lived off the land or never lived like we've lived up here, suddenly they find out that that you can actually grow food by planting a garden.
Sure.
And you can, if you put your clothes on a line, it'll dry. And some people now are discovering sugaring, and there's a lot of hobby people now. And you know what that means is if you talk to loggers now, it's actually hard to be able to find somebody, to find good stands of maple that people want you to cut because people are very protective now of their maple trees.
Yeah, there's a real advent now too of, and I don't want to say, oh, everyone's going big. No, you're right. A lot of homesteaders, these flat pans or 2x6, 2x4 evaporators out there that are it's hard to get hold of one this time of year. Good luck finding one because there's a lot of these small time sugar makers. They're making enough for their family, some relatives, some friends, sell a few gallons, sure, and they make a few bucks to help pay off some of the equipment. But it is the locavore movement's big, as well as the homestead movement. There's people, you look at how many chicken coops in the backyard.
Oh, sure.
So hand in hand, if you want to make, say you make 20 gallons, well, how much can you make? Well, if you cook with it exclusively, you'll go through about 10 gallons a year, plus what you put on your pancakes, whatever. So yeah, you have a few gallons for my folks, a few gallons for the cousin, and somebody stopped by. I know you make syrup. I see a little sugar house out back. You got some for sale? Yeah, I got a gallon for you.
Yeah. I know my neighbor is Paul and Betty Lehar, who've been sugaring for years.
Their whole life, yeah.
Right, and Paul says nothing. He said, even though I might not own that syrup anymore, he said when he sees people pour too much syrup on a pancake and it goes, you know, it ends up in the garbage or something, he says, I know how much work went into that, and it just like it gets to him.
And I understand that somebody has paid for that syrup or donated that syrup or whatever, but when you go to a pancake breakfast and you see syrup going in the trash because it was just too much poured on, you're like, geez, it's such a waste to me. And it's just, you're right, it's the sugar maker in us. It's paid for, it's taken care of, but the fact of the matter is you hate to see that. It's we try not to spill sap, and that's 1/40th of what you know.
Now Roy Davis, another prominent sugar maker who passed away in the last couple of years, he said he's every morning I'd go to his house when I was interviewing him. He'd be having his same thing. He said he had most of his life was he'd have hard-boiled egg and syrup.
Oh yeah,
and that was what he started his day off with.
What a great way to start, huh?
Yeah, because when I know my sons, when they were in college, they didn't war very often, but the one thing they warred about was their maple syrup, because one of them, he said he'll pour half a quart on his pancakes, and they would always run out.
Oh yeah.
But all right, what else do you have here?
Well, here's the thing: is you know, we've got some of the older packaging stuff you won't find out every day, even down to this. I like this piece. It's Golden Tree. It was a Boston company that was packaging syrup in glass back. You know, that's way back in the early 1900s. So that that's kind of neat to have a few pieces. I got a grading kit that it's a permanent, one of the first efforts at permanent grading kits, and it doesn't work anymore because the kit changed now. We have new names. So, and that's what when we at the open house. When we swinging back to that, when we take a tour now, we can talk about the new grades of syrup, because that still is foreign to a lot of people that grew up in the state.
You know, I don't taste that much of it. Maple syrup to me, I love it no matter what.
Yeah.
I really do. So again, what is the date of the open house?
Well, it's the second.
Dates?
The 2nd and 3rd. It's a Saturday and Sunday, April 2nd and 3rd. Most places are open during the middle of the day, so like from 10 to 4 we'll be open both days, and that's pretty common. Hours similar to that. So
if will the Sap still be running, or?
Well, looking at the weather forecast, it absolutely is possible, and we will hold back some sap to boil. We'll boil the old way on our. We have in the museum. It's a functional museum. We'll actually be making syrup on the old evaporator that day, the 2x4.
Now we've talked about how the weather a bit and how good it is this year, but what if we were to continue this pattern of weather? Are you skeptical about the future of sugaring?
Well, I'm not skeptical about the future of sugaring, but there are going to need to be some changes made, I think. We're already, the discussion for the first time ever, we discussed, do we tap, because we can make spouts stay alive, if you would, or functional. By running vacuum systems, we can keep, the mechanism is the natural occurring bacteria in sap. If it works its way back into the hole, then the tree knows to heal. But if we can keep the sap flowing forward, it slows that process down. And we might be able to tap in the fall, keeping the vacuum on during any of the warmer weather, and be able to extend the season so we catch fall syrup and spring. We're looking at, is that, as long as we don't hurt the tree, we don't take too many usable starches out of the root structure, is that doable? So I'm going to have a conversation with Proctor Research, which is University of Vermont's maple arm, and see if that, I think some people already started in that direction, but there's such, the weather is changing pretty rapidly. It's amazing to me how we're having such fluctuations that maybe it will level the volume of syrup made. Now this year is going to be a great year, but last year, you know, it was a little bit short for a lot of sugar makers in the area, and if we'd have caught a few of those thaws even, we were tapped in the fall, didn't even catch fall sap, but caught those thaws. There were 3 thaws last year that were possible to make syrup maybe, and we just didn't tap then.
And you've also experimented with birch sap.
We have.
How did that work?
It's interesting. I scratched my head wondering if we jump into this with both feet, because we were actually going to do it this year, but it is very cost and labor expensive to me. There's a lot of cost, a lot of time that you have to invest in this on the front end. And birch sap is not sweet, so you definitely need reverse osmosis. The sweetest it gets is about a quarter of what maple sap is. I mean, last year our sweetest birch sap was 0.7% sugar, where regular typical sap this year started at 2.5% sugar for maple. So you've got to run it through reverse osmosis. You've got to have separate tanks. You've got to have separate holdings, separate pipelines, separate everything. But remarkably, I love the flavor of maple, of birch. Completely different than maple. If you're thinking maple, it's different, but it's like cherry cola syrup with a dark tone to it.
Huh. Hey, you know, since we're talking a little bit about the history, is something, I have an article that I actually published, I believe it was from the early part of the last century or even further, it was an article that was written about something that would be taboo today. It was talking about sugaring and how the average palate would not accept pure maple syrup, so you had to add beet syrup and such to it. Now, today, that's like...
taboo's the right word. You don't mess with maple.
But it was actually a thought back 100+ years ago. It was an article that I published, and it was talking about that people cannot handle maple syrup, so you've got to cut it with like beet syrup and that.
Well, understand too, and this is maple syrup, the flavor of maple syrup back years ago, if they said, give me your best syrup, all you got was fancy grade, which is golden delicate now, but it was very light, very sweet, very delicate, and highly overpoweringly sweet, highly sweet. And now if you have a very dark, robust, or even a very dark, strong maple syrup, these are very mapley without a lot of sweetness, and that is taking place. The sorghum, the people who like sorghum, the people who like some of those Caro syrups, they're saying, okay, I can associate with that. That's a nice flavor. And we have made a lot of converts through the years by moving dark syrup to people who say, oh, maple's just too sweet. But back then, in order to reach out to these people, they thought adulterate possibly, but make it known that it's, don't do it quiet, behind the scenes. You actually be very open about it. But adulteration now, people, I tell you, you ought to hear the pushback I get. We make bourbon-infused maple syrup and rum-infused and habanero-infused and vanilla, cinnamon. And people say, oh, what are you doing to maple syrup? You're killing the flavors. No, we're not. We're accentuating these flavors
as long as people know it,
Right. But,
in almost closing, I'll say my pet peeve, I love the
this
travel.
Almost over already?
Yeah, just 2 more minutes. Is when I travel, I don't think I'm being lied to, but I don't think some people know. It's like when I love to travel, but I'll go to a motel somewhere and they'll have a breakfast there, or at a restaurant. I'll say, is this real syrup? Oh yeah, it's real syrup. Then I taste it. That's not real.
No, it's not.
But I don't think some people understand real.
No, I think you're right. We carry a jug with us. We bring it. Special for the occasion. We bring a jug, and one restaurant really took offense to that. But generally, so we put our jug on the table and we pass it around among ourselves. And we've even had people from the next table over say, "Excuse me, can we borrow some of your syrup?" So yeah, it's
okay. All right. We've got to wrap up. It goes really quick. But again, now, let's just go over the dates.
April 2nd and 3rd, and there are sugar houses. If you go to our website, you can see us. If you go to vermontmaple.org, you can see some of the other sugar makers in the county that are available. open to the public. We're open year-round, so if you don't make open house weekend, you can still come get a tour. We'll take you to the museum. We'll take you through our sugar house. We may or may not be boiling, but it's an open invitation. Please come on over.
And you have a regular store.
We do. We have actually a shop open to the public year-round.
Right. Okay. Hey, it was as always. It's great to have you come on. Another member of the class of North Country's 1984, and well, thanks.
We're turning 50 this year, so it's a big thing.
I am 50.
Oh, I will be.
But
you're older.
Okay. Well,
thank you very much, Scott. I appreciate being invited on.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.